A silver coin minted in the New World traveled across oceans, passed through the hands of Spanish merchants, English pirates, Chinese traders, and African kingdoms. It became the most trusted currency on the planet for over 300 years. It funded empires, started revolutions, and made pirates richer than kings. The Spanish dollar, the peso de ocho, the piece of 8. This wasn't just pirate treasure, this was the first global currency. And the story of how it came to rule the seas is darker and stranger than any movie ever showed you. The year is 1492. Christopher Columbus lands in the Caribbean, convinced he's found a shortcut to Asia. He's wrong about the geography, but he's right about one thing. There's wealth here, unimaginable wealth. Within 30 years, Spanish conquistadors have looted the Aztec and Inca empires of their gold and silver. Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan in 1519 and found a city built on wealth that made European capitals look poor by comparison. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma's treasury held gold masks, ceremonial objects, and tribute collected from across Mesoamerica. Cortés melted most of it down within months. Temples stripped bare, sacred artifacts reduced to ingots. The cultural heritage of an entire civilization turned into raw materials for the Spanish crown. When Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire in the 1530s, he found even more. The ransom paid for Atahualpa, the last Inca emperor, filled a room 22 feet long and 17 feet wide with gold objects stacked 7 feet high. Pizarro took the ransom and executed Atahualpa anyway. All of the gold melted down and shipped to Spain. But Spain had a problem. All this precious metal sitting in the Americas didn't help them unless they could turn it into currency. They needed a standardized coin, something that could be minted in massive quantities, shipped across the Atlantic, and trusted by merchants from London to Manila. European coins at the time were a mess. Each principality, duchy, and kingdom minted its own currency with different weights, different purities, and different values. A merchant traveling from Venice to Amsterdam might deal with a dozen different currencies, each requiring complex conversion rates and careful weighing to avoid getting cheated. Coin clipping was rampant. People would shave tiny amounts of precious metal from the edges of coins, then pass them off at full value. Over time, coins became lighter and less valuable, but still circulated at face value. Spain saw an opportunity. They controlled the largest source of precious metals in the world. If they could create a standardized coin and flood the global market with it, they could dominate international trade. In 1535, Spain established the first mint in the New World, not in Spain itself, but in Mexico City. The Casa de Moneda de Mexico began striking silver coins using metal from newly discovered mines. These weren't just any mines. These were the richest silver deposits ever found in human history. Cerro Rico, the mountain overlooking Potosí in what is now Bolivia, became the center of Spanish silver production. When the Spanish discovered silver there in 1545, they called it the mountain that eats men. Over the next 300 years, that mountain produced over 60,000 tons of silver, enough to mint billions of coins, enough to change the global economy forever. But that silver came at a cost. The mines at Potosí operated using the mita system, a form of forced labor inherited from the Inca Empire, but made far more brutal under Spanish rule. Indigenous men were conscripted to work in the mines for months at a time, deep underground in conditions that killed thousands. The air was thin at 13,000 feet above sea level. The tunnels were unstable. Mercury poisoning from the refining process caused tremors, madness, and death. One Spanish priest who visited Potosí in the 1590s estimated that over 8 million indigenous people had died in the mines since 1545. Modern historians put the number lower, but still in the hundreds of thousands. The wealth that built the Spanish Empire and created the Piece of 8 was bought with an ocean of blood. The coins themselves were minted to exact specifications. 8 reals, hence the name Piece of 8. Roughly 27 grams of silver, .903 fine. The coins bore the Spanish coat of arms on one side and the Pillars of Hercules on the other, representing Spain's claim to lands beyond the known world. The actual process of minting these coins was surprisingly crude, especially in the early years. Silver was extracted from ore using mercury amalgamation, a process that released toxic fumes and poisoned workers. The refined silver was then melted and poured into molds to create blanks. These blanks were weighed carefully, trimmed if necessary, and then struck between two dies using a hammer. The dies themselves were hand-engraved by skilled craftsmen in Spain and then shipped to the New World mints. Each die could strike thousands of coins before wearing out, but the quality varied wildly. Sometimes the blank wasn't centered properly. Sometimes the hammer blow was too weak or too strong. Sometimes the dies were worn and produced blurry images. Early pieces of 8 were crude, hand-struck with dies that left uneven edges and irregular shapes. These cob coins, as they were called, looked rough but contained the correct weight of silver. That was what mattered. Merchants didn't care if the coin was pretty. They cared that it was real. They could weigh a cob coin, test its purity with a touchstone, and know they were getting 27 grams of silver regardless of how ugly it looked. Later, as minting technology improved, the Spanish introduced milled coins with perfectly round edges and consistent designs. These pillar dollars featured two hemispheres representing the Old and New worlds separated by the Pillars of Hercules. They were beautiful coins, struck with screw presses that produced even pressure and clean designs. But even these refined coins followed the same weight standard as the crude cobs. The Spanish understood that trust came from consistency, not beauty. You could take a piece of 8 minted in Mexico City and spend it in London, Goa, or Shanghai, and people would accept it without question. That level of trust didn't exist for most currencies at the time. English coins were notoriously inconsistent. French livres varied in weight and purity, but the Spanish dollar was reliable. Merchants could weigh it, test it, and know exactly what they were getting. This reliability made the piece of 8 the currency of choice for international trade. The British East India Company used pieces of 8 to pay for goods in Asia. American colonists preferred them to British pounds. Even after the American Revolution, the US dollar was based on the Spanish dollar's weight and value. But before we get to that, we need to talk about how these coins moved around the world, because that's where the pirates come in. Spain shipped silver from the Americas in massive treasure fleets, the famous Manila galleons and Carrera de Indias convoys that sailed twice a year. These weren't small operations. A typical fleet might include 20 to 60 ships, heavily armed and loaded with treasure. The galleons were huge, some over 1,000 tons, with multiple decks and dozens of cannons. The logistics of these fleets were staggering. Ships gathered at designated ports in the Americas, Veracruz for the northern route and Cartagena for the southern route, where they would wait for months until enough cargo had been assembled and the weather was favorable. The fleets traveled together for protection, following established routes across the Atlantic. They sailed with the trade winds, heading northeast from the Caribbean through the Florida Straits, then catching the westerlies across to Europe. The journey took anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks under good conditions, but conditions were rarely good. Hurricanes struck the Caribbean with brutal force, especially during late summer and fall. Ships that were separated from the fleet during storms became easy targets for pirates and privateers. Captains who tried to sail alone, hoping to beat the competition to market, often disappeared without a trace. Navigation was primitive by modern standards. Captains used dead reckoning, measuring speed with a chip log and estimating position based on compass bearings and crude latitude measurements using an astrolabe or cross staff. There was no way to accurately measure longitude until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 1700s, which meant ships often wandered off course by hundreds of miles. A single galleon could carry 200,000 pieces of 8. That's over $10 million in today's money, just in silver coins, not counting gold, emeralds, pearls, and other cargo. The total value of a treasure fleet could exceed $100 million in modern terms. These were floating fortresses of wealth, sailing from Veracruz and Cartagena to Seville and Cadiz, crossing the Atlantic along routes that became legendary. The Spanish crown took a 20% cut of all treasure, the quinto real, or royal fifth. This tax funded Spain's wars in Europe, its bureaucracy, and its endless building projects. Without the constant flow of New World silver, Spain's empire would have collapsed decades earlier than it did. The treasure fleets weren't just commerce. They were the financial lifeline of Spanish power. But the Atlantic was dangerous. Hurricanes struck without warning, navigation was imprecise, ships ran aground on reefs or were blown off course into enemy waters. And then there were the pirates. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, coincides perfectly with Spain's dominance of New World silver. Pirates weren't raiding ships for barrels of rum and parrots. They were hunting Spanish treasure fleets carrying pieces of eight. Henry Morgan, one of the most successful privateers in history, understood this better than anyone. Morgan wasn't a rogue operating outside the law. He was a privateer, which meant he had official permission from the English government to attack Spanish ships and settlements. The English called it privateering. The Spanish called it piracy. The difference was just paperwork. In 1668, Morgan led a raid on Portobelo, one of Spain's most important ports in Panama. Portobelo was where silver from Peru was unloaded, stored, and prepared for shipment to Spain. It was heavily fortified with 3 castles and hundreds of soldiers. Morgan attacked with just 400 men. The raid was brutal. Morgan's men tortured prisoners to find hidden treasure. They held the city for ransom. When they finally left, they carried away 250,000 pieces of eight, along with other treasure. Morgan's share was enough to make him one of the richest men in Jamaica. He bought a plantation, married, and eventually became lieutenant governor of Jamaica. The line between pirate and respectable citizen was thinner than you'd think. But Morgan's men weren't so lucky. Most of them spent their shares within months. They drank in Port Royal's taverns, gambled in underground dens, and hired prostitutes until the money ran out. Port Royal, known as the wickedest city on earth, was built on pieces of eight. The entire economy ran on stolen Spanish silver. The city was like nothing else in the colonial world. Taverns lined every street. Houses of ill repute operated openly. Merchants sold goods looted from Spanish ships alongside legitimate trade goods, and nobody asked questions. A sailor with pockets full of pieces of eight could live like a king for a month, then die broke and be buried in an unmarked grave. Port Royal sat on a sand spit extending into Kingston Harbor, a perfect natural anchorage where ships could shelter from storms and careen for repairs. By the 1660s, over 6,000 people lived in Port Royal, making it one of the largest English settlements in the Americas. The town had over 200 shops, countless taverns, and warehouses stacked with goods from around the world. But the town was built on unstable ground, literally. The sand spit was loosely packed sediment that amplified earthquake shocks. On June 7, 1692, at 11:43 in the morning, a massive earthquake struck. The ground turned to liquid. Buildings sank into the sand. Entire streets disappeared into the harbor. A tsunami wave swept over what remained, drowning hundreds more. Contemporary accounts describe the horror. People were swallowed by the sand up to their necks, then drowned as the tide came in. Others were crushed by collapsing buildings or swept out to sea. The pirate haven that had stood for 30 years was destroyed in less than 10 minutes. 2/3 of the city sank into the sea, killing over 2,000 people immediately. Disease killed thousands more in the weeks that followed. Some saw it as divine punishment for the city's sins. Ministers preached that God had destroyed the modern Sodom. Others just saw it as bad luck, the inevitable result of building a city on sand in an earthquake zone. Either way, Port Royal's days as the pirate capital were over. Kingston, on the mainland across the harbor, became the new center of Jamaican commerce. The age of the pirate was ending. But why did pirates love pieces of eight so much? Why not just take goods and trade them later? The answer is simple. Pieces of 8 were liquid wealth. You didn't need to find a buyer. You didn't need to negotiate. You didn't need to worry about spoilage or storage. Silver coins were money immediately spendable anywhere in the world. Pirate crews operated under articles, written contracts that spelled out how treasure would be divided. Most crews used a points system. The captain got 2 shares. The quartermaster, who managed supplies and discipline, got 1.5 shares. The sailing master and gunner got 1.25 shares. Regular crew members got 1 share each. Injuries were compensated with bonuses. Lose an eye, get 100 pieces of 8. Lose an arm or leg, get 200 to 600 pieces of 8, depending on which limb. The right arm was worth more than the left because most men were right-handed. Pirates didn't have workers' compensation or disability insurance, but they had this. It was brutal math, but it was fair. The coins themselves were designed to be divisible. This is where things get really interesting. A piece of 8 could be cut into 8 pieces, called bits. Each bit was worth 1 real. If you needed to make change, you literally cut the coin apart with a chisel. This is where the phrase 2 bits comes from. 2 bits equaled $0.25, which is why Americans still call 25 cents 2 bits today, even though nobody has cut a coin apart in 200 years. For pirates dividing loot, this was perfect. A crew of 100 men splitting 10,000 pieces of 8 didn't need to worry about remainders. Cut the coins into bits, distribute them according to the articles, and everyone gets their exact share. No arguments, no fighting. Of course, this assumed the pirates trusted each other, which they often didn't. Pirate crews were democracies of a sort, but they were violent democracies. Captains who cheated their crews got marooned or murdered. Crew members who stole from the common fund got flogged or keel-hauled. The pieces of 8 themselves became objects of superstition. Some pirates believed certain coins were lucky. Others thought coins taken from a church were cursed. There are stories of pirates refusing to spend specific coins because they believed the silver was haunted by the souls of the miners who died extracting it. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. But we do know that pieces of 8 shaped pirate culture in ways that went beyond simple economics. However, the influence of the piece of 8 extended far beyond the Caribbean. While pirates were raiding Spanish ships in the Atlantic, the coins were flowing across the Pacific to Asia on the Manila galleons. The Manila galleon trade was one of the most profitable routes in history. Ships sailed from Acapulco to Manila carrying silver, then returned with silk, porcelain, and spices. The round trip took over a year and was incredibly dangerous. Ships were overloaded, storms were frequent, and scurvy killed sailors by the dozens. But the profits were enormous. A successful voyage could return 100% profit or more, and the currency that made it all work was the piece of 8. In China, the Spanish dollar became the preferred currency for foreign trade. Chinese merchants trusted it more than their own copper cash for large transactions. The coins were tested, weighed, and stamped with Chinese merchant marks to verify authenticity. By the 18th century, millions of pieces of 8 were flowing into China annually through trade in silk, tea, and porcelain. The Chinese called the coin yin yuan, or silver yuan, and it became so embedded in the economy that when China modernized its currency in the 20th century, they kept the name. The modern Chinese yuan traces its name directly back to the Spanish piece of 8. In India, pieces of 8 circulated alongside rupees and mohurs. The British East India Company preferred Spanish dollars for paying soldiers and buying goods because everyone accepted them. Even after Britain established its own currency systems in India, Spanish dollars remained in circulation well into the 1800s. In Africa, Spanish dollars were used to purchase slaves. European slave traders brought pieces of 8 to the West African coast, where they exchanged them with local rulers and traders for human beings who would be shipped to the Americas. The same silver mined by forced indigenous labor in Potosi was used to buy enslaved Africans who would work plantations in the Caribbean and mainland colonies. This is the dark circle that nobody talks about. Silver mined by enslaved indigenous people in Bolivia was shipped to Africa to buy enslaved Africans who were shipped to the Americas to work plantations that produced sugar and tobacco that was shipped to Europe to buy more silver. The Peace of Eight was the lubricant that made the entire system run. By the early 1700s, pieces of eight were circulating on every continent except Antarctica. They were the first truly global currency. A merchant in Boston could use the same coin as a trader in Canton. A soldier in Bombay could spend the same money as a plantation owner in Jamaica. But the coin also represented something else: freedom. For pirates, pieces of eight were the ultimate symbol of liberty. They weren't working for wages from a king or company. They were taking wealth directly from the system that oppressed them. Many pirates were former sailors who had been press-ganged into naval service, forced to work on warships under brutal conditions for almost no pay. Others were merchant seamen who had been cheated by ship owners who promised shares of profit but paid in scrip or company store credits. Piracy was a brutal, violent way to make a living, but it offered something the legitimate world didn't: a chance to get rich on your own terms, a chance to choose your own captain and vote him out if he failed, a chance to get compensated fairly for your labor and your risk. This is why pirate legends persist. Not because pirates were heroes, they weren't, but because they represented a challenge to the established order. They took wealth from empires and kept it for themselves. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, reportedly captured over 40 ships in less than 2 years. When he blockaded Charleston, South Carolina in 1718, he demanded a chest of medicine as ransom. Not gold, not silver, medicine. Because his crew was sick, and he knew the town would pay. After he got the medicine, he let the ships go. When Blackbeard was finally killed in a battle with British naval forces in 1718, they found his body had been shot 5 times and cut 20 times. They cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit of their ship as a warning. The British were terrified of pirates not just because they stole treasure, but because they represented an alternative to the system. Of course, this is a romanticized view. Pirates were violent criminals. They murdered, tortured, and terrorized. They didn't oppose slavery on principle. Many pirates sold captured slaves for profit or kept them as forced labor on their ships. Some pirate crews were multiracial and relatively egalitarian, but others weren't. The mythology of the pirate as a free agent, living outside the law and getting rich on stolen Spanish silver, has endured for centuries. And the Peace of Eight is at the center of that mythology. The decline of piracy in the 1720s and 1730s came not from moral reformation, but from economic and military changes. European navies became more powerful and more willing to hunt pirates aggressively. The British Royal Navy established permanent patrols in the Caribbean. Colonial governments offered pardons to pirates who gave up the life, and many accepted. Woodes Rogers, the governor of the Bahamas, famously offered a proclamation for suppressing of pirates in 1718, promising pardons to any pirate who surrendered. Hundreds of pirates took the deal. They gave up their ships, their weapons, and their stolen treasure in exchange for a clean slate. Some became privateers, legally attacking enemy ships during times of war. Others became merchants, plantation owners, or tavern keepers. A few even became pirate hunters, using their knowledge of pirate tactics to track down former colleagues. Without the constant flow of Spanish treasure fleets to raid, piracy became less profitable. The Spanish had learned their lesson. They reduced the size of individual treasure shipments. They increased naval escorts. They changed routes unpredictably. They built better forts at key ports. The risk no longer matched the reward. By the mid-1700s, the Golden Age of Piracy was over, but pieces of eight continued circulating for another century. The coin's influence extended into the 19th century and even the 20th. When Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, it continued minting its own version of the Spanish dollar, which became known as the Mexican peso. These coins were widely used in international trade, particularly in Asia. In China, the Mexican peso became so prevalent that it was the de facto currency for foreign transactions well into the 20th century. Even after the Chinese government tried to replace it with their own currency, merchants preferred the trusted silver peso. During the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s, people hoarded Mexican silver dollars because they held value when paper money became worthless. The piece of 8 shaped modern currency systems in ways most people don't realize. The idea of a standardized, internationally accepted coin, the practice of dividing currency into smaller denominations, the use of silver as a backing for paper money. All of these concepts trace back to the Spanish dollar. When the United States was founded, the Founding Fathers faced a decision about currency. They could create something entirely new, or they could base their dollar on an existing standard. They chose the latter. The Coinage Act of 1792 defined the U.S. dollar as equivalent in value and weight to the Spanish dollar, 371.25 grains of pure silver, the same as a piece of 8. This wasn't just practical, it was strategic. American merchants needed a currency that would be accepted internationally. By tying the dollar to the piece of 8, they ensured instant credibility. A Spanish dollar and an American dollar were interchangeable. Both contained the same amount of silver. Both were trusted. Spanish dollars remained legal tender in the United States until 1857. You could walk into a bank in New York or Philadelphia in 1850 and pay with a piece of 8 minted 100 years earlier in Mexico City, and it would be accepted without question. Some Americans preferred Spanish dollars because they trusted the minting quality more than early U.S. coins. The piece of 8 also left its mark on language. The dollar sign, the symbol we use every day, is believed to have evolved from the Spanish coat of arms stamped on pieces of 8. The coat of arms featured 2 pillars representing the Pillars of Hercules, with a banner wrapped around them forming an S shape. Over time, the pillars became vertical lines and the banner became the S, creating the dollar sign we know today. The term dollar itself comes from taler, a silver coin used in Europe, but it was the Spanish dollar that made the word universal. Today, over 20 countries use currencies called dollars, and they all trace back to the piece of 8. But the legacy of the piece of 8 is more than financial. It's cultural. Treasure maps marked with X, chests overflowing with silver coins, pirates burying their loot on remote islands. These images come from stories about pieces of 8. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, cemented the piece of 8 in popular imagination. The book's pirates obsess over pieces of 8. They sing songs about them, they kill for them. In reality, most pirates didn't bury treasure, they spent it, fast. The idea of buried treasure comes from a few isolated incidents, like Captain Kidd allegedly burying treasure before his arrest in 1699, but even that story is probably exaggerated. But the myth persists because the piece of 8 represents something larger than money. It represents adventure, freedom, and the possibility of getting rich outside the system. It represents a time when the world was less mapped, less controlled, and more chaotic. Today, pieces of 8 are collector's items. Authentic coins from the 1600s and 1700s sell for hundreds or thousands of dollars, depending on condition and provenance. The most valuable pieces of 8 are the early cob coins, with their irregular shapes and hand-struck designs. Collectors prize them for their historical significance and their connection to the age of exploration and piracy. Shipwreck salvagers search the Caribbean for sunken Spanish galleons, hoping to find chests of silver coins that have been underwater for 300 years. The most famous treasure find in recent history was the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, a Spanish galleon that sank in a hurricane off the Florida Keys in 1622. Treasure hunter Mel Fisher spent 16 years searching for the wreck. He'd mortgaged his house. He faced bankruptcy. His son and daughter-in-law died in a diving accident during the search, but he kept going. In 1985, his team finally found the main treasure pile. The haul included hundreds of thousands of pieces of 8, along with gold bars, emeralds, and other treasure. The total value exceeded $450 million. Fisher's discovery reignited interest in Spanish treasure and pieces of 8. It proved that the stories weren't entirely myth. There really were fortunes in silver sitting on the ocean floor, waiting to be found. After Fisher's find, hundreds of treasure hunting companies formed, searching for shipwrecks throughout the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast. But the Atocha treasure also highlighted the dark side of that wealth. The silver on that ship came from mines worked by indigenous people under brutal conditions. The galleon was part of a system that extracted wealth from the Americas to enrich Europe. The pieces of 8 weren't just coins. They were symbols of colonialism, slavery, and exploitation. And yet, they remain objects of fascination. Walk into any museum with a colonial history section and you'll find pieces of 8 on display, often marked as pirate treasure, even when there's no evidence pirates ever touched them. The coins are beautiful in their own way, with their hand-struck designs and the patina of age. They're tangible connections to a world that no longer exists. The piece of 8 built the modern world in ways we still see today. The US dollar, the world's reserve currency, traces its origins to this Spanish coin. Stock markets, international banking, and global trade all rely on concepts of standardized currency that the piece of 8 pioneered. Before the Spanish dollar, there was no universal currency. After it, the idea became inevitable. But it also built that world on a foundation of violence and extraction. The silver came from mines that killed tens of thousands. It fueled wars across Europe. It funded the Spanish Inquisition. It enabled the transatlantic slave trade. Every piece of 8 represented not just 8 relays of silver, but a system of exploitation that spanned continents. The pirates who stole pieces of 8 weren't heroes, but they weren't the villains of the story either. The real villains were the systems that made those coins so valuable in the first place. The empires that murdered and enslaved to extract wealth. The merchants who traded human lives for silver. The governments that sent treasure fleets loaded with stolen riches across the ocean. And in the end, the piece of 8 represents a paradox. It was a tool of empire and a symbol of freedom. It built nations and funded rebellions. It was the most trusted currency in the world and the most bloodstained. It connected people across oceans and represented the violence that made those connections possible. A single coin, 8 reels of silver, shaped 300 years of history. And its legacy is still with us today. Every time you see a dollar sign or hear someone say, 2 bits. Every time you use a standardized currency that's accepted internationally. Every time you think about pirates and treasure. The piece of 8 didn't just build the pirate world, it built our world. The global economy we live in today, with its standardized currencies and international trade, descends directly from the Spanish dollar. The idea that money should be the same everywhere, that a coin should be worth its weight in precious metal, that currency should be divisible and portable, all of these concepts were perfected by the piece of 8. That's the real treasure. Not the silver itself, but the idea behind it. The idea that changed how the world did business. And that idea, for better or worse, is still ruling us today.